Hi, welcome to Daydreams of Quilts. Today we are sewing this Tents in the Campground quilt block. This is the third free quilt block for our August series of blocks. So head to daydreamsofquiltsblog.com and download your free pattern and get your pieces cut out. And we're going to draw a diagonal line across the larger background square and then set our 1/4 inch mark on that line and draw another line. And then I'm just going to flip it around and do a third line that is also a 1/4 inch from that first line that we drew. And then that's what it looks like. We're going to sew on each of the outside lines and cut on that center line. So I'm going to line that up with my orange tent fabric when I go to the machine. But first I'm going to draw a diagonal line on the backs of the other background squares. Just one diagonal line this time. And I'll put a link in the description below to both the PDF pattern as well as I'll see if I can find this ceramic tip pencil that I'm using on Amazon, and I'll put an affiliate link in the description for the pencil. So once I have all of these lines drawn, we can get going on sewing. Oh wait, I still have to do the black squares. So I'm using a chalk liner to do my line on the black squares so that I can see it. I'll try to find a link for you for that as well, and if I can, it will be an affiliate link for Amazon, and I would appreciate it if you are able to purchase from my link. It doesn't cost you anything, but I may earn a small commission. Okay, so we can head over to the sewing machine, line up our squares, and sew on the two outside lines. You could also make a mark on your machine that's a 1/4 inch from the center of the needle, but since we're just doing the one square, it's just as easy to just draw 3 lines. And once we've got those 2 outer pencil lines sewn on, we will head back to the cutting board and cut down that first line, the center line. So I'm going to line my ruler up with one of the seam lines and have it right on that center pencil line, and just cut right down the middle. Then we'll have 2 pieces with 1/4 inch seams. We'll open that out and press towards the orange side. So here are our pieces. They should be 6.5 inch squares at this point. We will just trim off those dog ear corners and check to make sure they're 6.5 inch squares. And then we can move on to the next step of making this lower half of our block. Once we have these dog-eared corners out of the way, okay, so our pieces are going to be looking like that in the block to make the tent shape, and then we'll add these black corner squares down in the bottom corners. We'll sew right on that chalk line. So I'm sewing right down my chalk line, and then we'll get those trimmed a 1/4 inch from that seam line. On each side. And then we'll flip that black corner out. But first, let's get it trimmed. So we're putting our 1/4 inch mark of our ruler right on the seam, and we're trimming a 1/4 inch away from the seam. And then we'll flip those black corners out and press towards the corner. And now we can sew those 2 halves together to make our larger tent. This is the 3rd block in our camping block series for August. There was also a dome tent block and a large tree block so far. Okay, so then we'll press our seam to one side. You can also press it open, but pressing it to one side makes it a stronger seam. And now we have our tent rectangles, and we're going to sew right down our drawn pencil line on one of the squares on each of the rectangles. We're making flying geese here. These are going to make our smaller tents in the background of our block. And we'll do the same thing that we've done before, where we put our ruler onto that seam and trim a 1/4 inch away. So put your 1/4 inch mark right on the seam and trim. And in this case, we're not going to press towards the orange, we're going to press towards the white, or whatever your background color is. Okay, and now we're going to do the same thing for the second half of those flying geese squares or rectangles. So we'll put our square onto the other side of that piece and sew right down the pencil line. And the same thing for the second rectangle. And we'll repeat what we did before to trim off the excess fabric. And then we'll get those corners pressed out towards the corner. And that makes our smaller tents. Okay, so now we're going to sew our 4.5 inch background squares onto the top of one of the tents and the bottom of the other tent. And just be careful when you're sewing this one that you don't blunt the tip of your tent. So just sew a little bit, like 1 thread length to the side of where all those pieces are intersecting. And just go slowly over that, where that tip is, and then you won't blunt off the top of your triangle. And then the bottom, the one where we sew to the bottom, is easier. And on both of these pieces, we're going to press towards that background square. And then we're going to sew that rectangle piece of background fabric right between those 2 smaller tent pieces. So just be careful not to get your seams flipped over the opposite way of how you press them when you're sewing. And on this piece, we will press towards that center rectangle. once we have it pressed, we're going to sew those two halves of our block together. And again, we're going to be careful going over that tip of that lower, larger tent so that we don't blunt our triangle. And I'm using clips here to hold this in place, just to make sure that I don't shift when I'm trying to get past that tip. And again, just sew like a thread width away from where all of those seams are intersecting. And then we'll press towards the top of the block. And here is our finished Tents in Campground block. Thank you for sewing along with me today. I hope you're having fun with this free pattern series, and we'll see you next time on Daydreams of Quilts.